In the days following the end of Operation Avenger, the German 1st Parachute Division took over the entire casino sector, increasing the number of paratroopers to 2,500. The divisional artillery was located on Monte Cassino, along with the rest of the German artillery force. The 4th Parachute Regiment took over the key positions from Snake's Head Ridge to Hill 445. The 1st Parachute Regiment was allocated to the left flank, and the 3rd Parachute Regiment was deployed from the Monastery to the town. It was reinforced by a machine gun battalion, 1 Grenadier Battalion, 1 anti-tank company, and 1 Engineers Company. During the lull before the next Allied offensive, the division had been constructing more defensive emplacements. A company of 80 paratroopers transformed the destroyed monastery into a fortress. 6 machine guns and 2 mortars were installed amid the ruins, and ammunition was safely stockpiled in the underground passages. A telephone network that connected artillery observers with the batteries on Monte Cassino was also installed. The defense of the town was entrusted to the 28-year-old Captain Ferdinand Fulton from Austria, who was commanding 2nd Battalion. The main strongholds around which the fiercest fighting would take place were the Hotel Continental, the Hotel Roses, the railway station, the Baron's Palace, and the Colosseum, which was an old stone-built mansion. All access routes to these buildings were covered by mines, machine gun nests, and snipers. 5 assault guns placed on key positions of the town would provide more firepower to the paratroopers. Meanwhile, on the Allied side, General Alexander ordered Freyberg to prepare the 3rd battle for Monte Cassino. But Freyberg's mind seemed unable to go beyond the flattening bombardment tactics of the First World War. His plan, codenamed Operation Dickens, was a frontal attack against the town and the monastery. This time it was the town's turn to be pulverized. Freyberg estimated that with another massive carpet bombing, the town could be captured in 12 hours. Inexplicably, no one ever suggested the bombing of the monastery, although it was definitely known that this time there were German paratroopers inside the ruins. Freyberg also wanted to add a surprise armored thrust using the narrow mountain track that runs parallel to Snake's Head Ridge and leads to the rear of the monastery. Preparations for the battle were complete by February 24th, but 3 weeks of constant rain delayed the attack into March. The attack finally began on March 15th with a 3.5-hour bombardment that covered the town in a pall of dark gray dust.
543 Allied planes tried to blast the enemy out of the town with a load of 1,144 tons of bomb. The Germans took cover in caves and tunnels.
Some of the German survivors described their horrifying experiences. The whole earth shuddered under the impact. Dust and dirt burst into the cellar, going into eyes, ears, and mouth. We could do nothing but whimper and scream. I knew I couldn't survive that hell. I only hoped that death would be instant. The bombardment killed about half of the 300 paratroopers in the town and destroyed 4 of the 5 assault guns. The survivors were struggling to breathe and used their gas masks for the first time in the war, until the filters were clogged with dust. When the New Zealand infantry approached the town, it started to rain again. The water slowly filled the cellars, drowning those unfortunately trapped under the rubble. The streets were so full of rubble and craters that the estimated advance of 100 meters per 10 minutes was reduced to 100 meters per hour. By nightfall, the Germans were again ready for battle and repulsed the first attacks of the 25th and 26th Battalions. Soaked by the rain, the New Zealanders were outraged at the thought that their depleted opponents were still putting up such a fierce resistance. While the assault in the town had stalled, D Company of the 25th Battalion achieved the only notable success of the day. At Castle Hill, the German garrison of 43 paratroopers had been decimated by the carpet bombing, and for the handful of survivors left, it was impossible to cover every side of the medieval fort on the top. When the New Zealanders attacked from 2 sides, the Germans were overwhelmed. Only a single survivor managed to escape to the monastery. D Company has secured the first objective at the cost of only 6 killed and 15 wounded. The 1st Royal Essex Battalion arrived the next day to reinforce the position. On March 16th, the Gurkhas of the 1st Battalion started their ascent to Hangman's Hill, but stopped once they came under fire from the monastery. During the night, C and D companies searched for a different track in the same direction. While D Company ran into an ambush, C Company vanished without a trace and suddenly appeared on Hangman's Hill the next day. The problem was that the 200 Gurkhas were completely cut off from their battalion and unprepared for such a development. In the early hours of March 17th, they were reinforced just in time to repel a counterattack. The infiltration on Hangman's Hill created a dangerous gap in the German defenses. The Allies had now 2 springboards on the mountain from which they could launch attacks not only against the monastery, but also against the town. The Germans counterattacked with only 55 men who were supported by every available weapon around the monastery. After a brief hand-to-hand fighting, they retreated with 18 wounded and, remarkably, not a single dead. On the afternoon of March 18th, Allied aircraft dropped parachute supply containers onto the Gurkhas' position, guided by red smoke. This prompted the Germans to fire red smoke flares to confuse the Allied planes, so a fair proportion of the supplies dropped on German-held territory. With the Indians on Hangman's Hill isolated, the Germans turned their attention to Castle Hill. On March 19th, the Germans launched 3 successive assaults. In their third assault, they demolished a part of the northern wall with explosives and then stormed inside through the breach. When this last assault was beaten off, the German force had been reduced to 40 men. On the Allied side, 63 men were still fit for combat, and all officers had been killed or wounded. In the ruins of the town, the fighting continued with undiminished ferocity. Every night, the Germans were able to slip into parts of the town that had been cleared. With weeks of local knowledge behind them, they had a great advantage over the Allies. By the evening of March 16th, roughly 2/3 of the town was in Allied hands. However, this did not mean Cassino had been taken. For as long as the Germans held the well-built strongholds in the town and the monastery itself, Cassino remained unconquered. On March 17th, the 26th Battalion captured the Botanical Gardens, the Colosseum, and the railway station. The Germans attempted to recapture the railway station with an almost suicidal attack. A total of 62 men advanced from the west across the Gary River. While the paratroopers were still on the western bank of the river, they were hit by friendly mortar fire, killing or wounding half of them. The survivors crossed the river without assault boats, holding their weapons above their heads. With numb limbs and shaking from the cold, they attacked against 200 New Zealanders, backed by 12 Sherman tanks. Within seconds, 11 attackers were dead or wounded, and the remaining 19 crossed the river back to their lines under a smokescreen cover. On March 19th, General Heydrich, commander of the 1st Parachute Division, decided to replace Fulton with Captain Renicky, a veteran of Crete, Russia, and Sicily. Fulton had achieved more than what was expected of him, but was worn out by 20 sleepless days and nights. Soldiers on both sides were exhausted by the lack of sleep. For some, it was impossible to acknowledge or follow orders. Freyberg, however, had not played his last card yet. It was time for his surprise armored attack. The whole plan was reminiscent of the crossing of the Alps by Hannibal, and surely the last thing the Germans ever expected was an armor attack at a height of 500 meters. 44 armored vehicles of the 20th Armored Regiment started rolling towards Albanetta Farm, which was a medieval farm complex of ruined buildings with large cellars that were used by the Germans as supply depots and field hospitals. It was the most daring attack of the battle, but rushed and poorly planned. Infantry support was not provided, although there were 18 British battalions in reserve outside of Cassino. Moreover, nobody seemed to have thought what 35 isolated armor vehicles were supposed to achieve outside the massive walls of the monastery. The drive along the path wasn't easy. The drivers had a hard time steering their vehicles with their hatches closed. Once the column reached Albanetta and the first shots were fired, the Germans were taken by surprise, but recovered quickly when they realized that there was no infantry support. The commander of the leading Sherman was shot in the head by a sniper, which forced the other commanders to duck inside their tanks and limit their visibility. Although the anti-tank weapons the Germans had at their disposal were 3 rocket launchers and a handful of mines, they managed to take 19 tanks out of action. The remaining tanks retreated with their turrets facing backwards, firing deterring shots against the German positions. The successive failures caused great consternation among the Allied staff. The date fixed for the landing on France was drawing near, and Churchill was impatient. On March 21st, General Alexander warned Freyberg that he would have to call off the operation unless successful results were obtained within the next 24 hours. In a last-ditch effort, Freyberg renewed the attack against the two hotels. This last attack didn't fare much better, and Operation Dickens was called off the next day. Hangman's Hill was evacuated on March 24th. Castle Hill and the train station were the only actual gains of the third battle. The Allied casualties numbered 2,100 killed, wounded, or missing. The German casualties were 320 killed and 114 wounded. On March 26th, the New Zealand Corps was officially withdrawn from the battlefield. But the German field commanders harbored no illusions. It was obvious that Cassino could not be held much longer. Once the Allies consolidated their lines, they began to assemble more troops and supplies for what would hopefully be the final battle at Monte Cassino.